Hi there everyone, and welcome to today's webinar where we are going to be talking about DPAs, data processing agreements, and some of the contracting issues you need to think through when you're trying to contract with your vendors. So the speakers today, you've got myself, Lucy Fisher, a partner based out here in our Silicon Valley office, and my fantastic colleague Richard Lawn, who's also based out here with me in the US. Now, just a quick apology. We usually have to start these webinars with an apology, but we were actually supposed to do this session live last week, but unfortunately, owing to some technical issues, we had to cancel the live session. But we're following up on our promise to make sure that we delivered this content to you. So Richard and I are actually recording this today, pre-recording this, and we'll be distributing it on all the usual channels afterwards. Also, just to let you know that this is actually the third webinar in our series, which is focused on vendor privacy management as a general topic. So in the first two webinars, myself and a few of my other colleagues have discussed some of the pre-contractual due diligence requirements that you need to think about when you're engaging a vendor. And we've also thought about how to do some of those risk assessments, both from a transfer impact assessment perspective and a security and privacy risk assessment perspective. So we really encourage you to go and have a look at some of those other webinars in this series to get the full picture on all of the issues that you need to think about, because it's not just about the contract. But today we're going to be focused on what you need to think about when you're contracting with your vendor. And so to be clear, we're very much approaching this webinar from the perspective of being a customer who's engaging a vendor, and principally a customer who's engaging a vendor who's going to be acting as a data processor. We will touch on some of the other issues that can come from contracting with vendors who are controllers, but the primary focus on here is your standard kind of controller to processor or processor to processor relationship, and some of the key contractual issues that you'll need to think through.
Right, so without further ado, let's kick off with some initial considerations where you're contracting with a vendor and you're looking to put a DPA in place. Now, these are some of the most important questions you should consider before you're even looking at the terms on paper. So on the left, we've got some factual questions. You should always bear in mind, number one, what services are the vendor providing? Number two, what data is the vendor processing? And number three, where is the vendor going to be processing the data, or where is the vendor going to be transferring the data to? Now, those are really important questions. They're going to not only dictate what terms you actually need to put in place, but they might also inform your overall strategy for negotiating the DPA with your vendor. So, for example, if this is an engagement with a vendor where there's going to be a long-established relationship, perhaps the vendor is going to be processing particularly sensitive or important data, then clearly you're going to want to spend more time and effort in negotiating a robust set of terms as compared to, say, a smaller vendor, maybe an ad hoc one-off arrangement where the vendor is only going to be processing a small volume of data, maybe a few email addresses, and therefore it's not going to be as much of a priority. So always think about the context here, the vendor, what they're doing, and the services when you're negotiating your DPA. Then apart from that, we also have some more kind of legal contractual things to think about as well, and that's on the right-hand side of the deck. So first of all, battle of the forms. Whose terms are you going to be using? Are you going to be contracting based off of the vendor's own DPA, or are you seeking to impose your own set of terms on the vendor? Now, clearly, this one comes down to your negotiating position and what leverage you might have. If it's a small vendor, maybe a startup, then they might not even have their own DPA, but they might also be more likely to acquiesce to using your terms because they're keen on getting that revenue through the door and getting the deal signed. Whereas some of the bigger players like AWS or Salesforce, they're not even going to entertain the idea of using anything apart from their own terms. So that's going to be a non-starter. So think about what terms you're using. Now, is it really important and is it crucial that you try and get the vendor on your own set of terms? Well, not necessarily. You might be able to get to the same position using their terms as a starting point, but obviously the vendor's going to be in a much better position there. You're effectively got an uphill battle Whereas if you are, oh, pardon me, the slide's moving around. Whereas if you can get the vendor onto your own terms, clearly those have been prepared to meet your own legal, commercial, operational needs. You know they provide the standard of protection you're going to need from the vendor. So that puts you at the top of the hill, and it's the vendor who's facing that uphill struggle. Okay, another thing to think about is the structure. So how is this DPA going to sit within the overall contracting arrangement with the vendor? And this is really going to depend on what's appropriate for that particular situation. In many cases, you're going to have an MSA or a main services agreement with the vendor, and the DPA is going to be similarly acting as kind of an umbrella set of terms for all of the processing that is going to be performed by the vendor when it's providing its services. But in some cases, you might need a slightly different structure. For instance, if there are a number of different services being provided under SOWs, and they all have a slightly different kind of arrangement, then it might be more appropriate to have standalone or separate DPAs. Again, that's going to depend, but it's something to think about. The third box we've got there at the bottom, scope, that's a really fundamental question, something actually that Flip's going to talk more about later on. And when we're talking about scope of the DPA, we're thinking about both the material scope, what data is within scope of those terms, what data is going to be subject to those obligations, and we're also thinking about the territorial scope of the DPA. So where does this data originate from? What laws do we have to be thinking about? And therefore, what standards and laws do we have to apply to the data as well?
And the other thing just to say about structure there is, as Richard indicated, you usually have a master services agreement which frames the overall kind of relationship. And then the data processing terms would usually sit under that MSA. So it's very common for the DPA, as we call it, the data processing agreement, to actually be an addendum to the master services agreement. But sometimes it can be, it may be more appropriate to have it as an entirely separate agreement that establishes a very different kind of liability and other things with the vendor. So just thinking through whether or not you're happy for it to be an addendum, like it's incorporated into that main services agreement, or whether it's appropriate to establish a completely separate agreement with the vendor. And then also in terms of scope, just thinking through, do you need this data processing agreement or addendum to cover, not just you as an organisation, but also your affiliates and other parties that may be using the services under the MSA. So just making sure that in terms of the scope, it covers all of the entities that that need to be protected by those data protection terms.
The last key issue we've got on this slide is around the vendor's processing role. Now, I think in most cases, and probably the default position, is that if you're engaging a vendor, then they're likely to be acting as your processor or your service provider. And that's only because they're receiving the data and using it on your behalf. They're not seeking to use it for their own purposes. And therefore, you're looking at a controller-processor relationship. Now, there might be some cases where a vendor's acting with a degree of autonomy, perhaps a level of independence, that means actually, in fact, it's more acting as a controller in its own right, and therefore you're looking at a controller-to-controller relationship. So some examples might be a marketing agency that's conducting marketing campaigns on your own behalf. Perhaps it's a recruitment agency that's got its own pool of candidates that it's sourcing independently. Or maybe it's a benefits provider who's providing services directly to your employees. Whatever the situation is, if the vendor thinks it's a controller, it's important to remember, well, can the vendor explain and justify why it's acting as a controller and not as a processor? Does it make sense in the context of the relationship? And also, even if they are a controller, you're still going to want to impose certain terms on them. It might not look exactly the same as a processor relationship, but there are going to be some similarities there. Now, for the remainder of this session, as Flip says, we're going to be focusing on controller to processor arrangements and processor DPAs. But it's something to bear in mind that some of the things we'll be discussing will still be relevant in that controller scenario too.
And we have actually done another webinar on controller to controller contracting scenarios. If you go back into the Fieldfisher Silicon Valley YouTube archive, you can find a really good webinar that kind of explores those particular relationships you want to think about when you're contracting on a controller basis.
Okay, so let's start looking at the paper itself. So with a controller to process a DPA, what are some of the terms that it should cover? Now, here's a list, and it's based on the Article 28 of the GDPR, which is that article which sets out these are the terms which have to be in place between a controller and a processor. And I'm sure that much of this is very familiar to our audience. So we've got things around processing instructions, we have confidentiality and security terms, we have terms around data deletion. All of these are pretty fundamental. We've included a few here which are not specifically called out by the GDPR, but they might still be needed depending on the situation. So for instance, not only do you want the vendor to always be following your instructions, but you might want to impose some specific restrictions or prohibitions around their use of the data, and that might be appropriate if there's a particular sensitivity around the data, if it's regulated, or if it's special category data, or all of those kind of things. Additionally, we've got data transfers on our list, because if you're transferring data to a vendor who is outside of Europe, or maybe the vendor is going themselves to be processing the data outside of Europe in a non-adequate country, then you're going to have to be thinking about Chapter 5 of the GDPR and making sure that you've got an appropriate transfer mechanism in place. And then at the bottom of the list, we've got liability. Now, the GDPR doesn't specifically say anything about what liability terms should be in place between the controller and the processor as a contractual matter. But clearly, it's an important one to think about and one of the most heavily negotiated aspects of the DPA. So we're going to be covering that today as well.
And just to say here that, I think we've all seen a trend over the last few years since the GDPR came into effect of DPAs getting longer and longer, and in many cases more onerous, as it almost becomes a kind of dumping ground for lots of terms that people are trying to get their vendors to comply with. And we're starting to see this overall trend that DPAs are moving further away from the core GDPR requirements to imposing, in some cases, extremely high standard for vendors to comply with. And in some cases, there are good reasons to be holding your vendors to that incredibly high standard. But I think there is a balance to be struck here, because you can create a DPA that's just so onerous that it's going to clog up your vendor procurement process. And is going to create a scenario where you're just ending up, vendors won't sign it, or you're involved in protracted negotiations. The teams are getting very frustrated because the lawyers are holding up the procurement process because they're absolutely wedded to an incredibly strict and onerous one-size-fits-all DPA. So I think to Richard's original point in the beginning, the GDPR has always called for this risk-based approach, and I think that we do need to bring a sensible approach to how you're drafting the DPA, because if you've got something that's just so restrictive and not necessarily reflective of the types of services that are being provided, you can create a scenario where you're just blocking up the whole procurement chain. So something to bear in mind there, because we've started to see a crazy number of very, very overly laden DPAs that have even got terms that aren't even data privacy terms. They're just lumping in all sorts of additional commercial terms or extra regulatory requirements that many vendors just won't be able to, comply with. So something to bear in mind there.
Yeah, and with that in mind, one thing to think about is what is important to us, what's our real focus area of the DPA, and what do we want to be strict about when we're negotiating these terms. We can either agree to a lighter set of terms or a lighter touch in certain areas, and that's going to be perhaps less beneficial to us, but easier to negotiate, and then concentrate more and be more prescriptive in certain areas that are more important to us. It's more difficult to negotiate back to us, but it's speaking more closely to what your priorities are.
Yeah, and we'll see later on when we get to touch on liability as a topic, that if you can't have your cake and eat it in some sense. If you're presenting incredibly onerous terms to a vendor and then asking them to accept kind of unlimited liability on a fully indemnified basis, they're much more likely to push back on that. So there does, again, if you can create a more balanced set of terms, you're more likely to get a more reasonable liability position as well.
So we obviously don't have time to talk through every single aspect of the DPA. So what we've decided to do is focus on some key issues, the areas which generally attracts the most attention when you're negotiating the DPAs, and probably the most important areas that you're going to be thinking about. The first of those is the scope of the DPA, and I'll come back to Flick for this slide.
Yeah, so obviously Article 28 of the GDPR, which is, as Richard laid out on the previous slide, which sets out all of the terms that you have to include in your contract to meet the GDPR requirements, is very much focused on the processing of personal data. But of course, there could be a scenario where there are other regulatory obligations that apply that extend that protect not just personal data, that go beyond and protect data in general, and therefore you might need to think about, hang on a second, does my data processing agreement, because of the nature of the data that's being processed and regulatory obligations that apply to it, does it need to extend to protect data beyond just personal data? So one example would be the NIS directive in Europe is Europe's kind of cybersecurity law, and that regulates the processing of all data if you're within the scope of the NIS directive. And so you might need to think about making sure that the security requirements that you're imposing on your vendors extend beyond just personal data. So that's one example there. And then there are, other regulations in Europe, like the e-privacy directive, which regulates marketing compliance in Europe and cookie compliance. Again, that is not concerned with whether or not the data is personal data or not. It's concerned with a particular processing activity being undertaken. So again, that might impact the scope of the DPA. You might need to extend the obligations beyond just the processing of personal data. And again, having a focus on the processing activities. So in the DPA, there should be a very clear description of the types of data that are being processed and the processing purposes. Because remember, when you're engaging a data processor, they're only ever allowed to process data under your instructions and for the purposes that are being clearly agreed in the contract. And so you need to just go and make sure that those processing descriptions actually are accurate and complete enough. Are there any gaps there? Has the vendor tried to narrow the scope of the processing activities so that actually some of the activities that are being undertaken aren't actually caught by the scope of the GDPR, of the DPA? So being very clear when you go and look in those processing annexes or descriptions that they're sufficiently broad or accurately describing the types of activities that are going to be undertaken by the vendor.
Yeah, and as a general rule, you're probably going to want to push for a broader scope. You want this to cover a broad scope of personal data and the broad definition of what activities are covered under the DPA, whereas the vendor's objective will be to try and limit the scope of their obligations and their commitments. And they may have a few sneaky tricks up their sleeve to try and carve out their commitments, maybe with a more tailored and scoped definition of personal data, or maybe a separate definition of covered data, or whatever it might be, just to more clearly define their commitments. So you need to be looking at some of those definitions and the descriptions in the annexes quite closely to make sure that you're comfortable that the scope is broad enough.
Yeah. And then this other question of territorial scope is actually becoming an increasingly hot topic around data processing agreements, because of course the GDPR clearly sets out contracting requirements, but there are other GDPR-like laws emerging around the globe that also kind of dictate what terms may need to be included in the contract. And so when you're thinking about, if you're going into an arrangement with a vendor where they could be processing personal data on a global basis, there may be other regulatory requirements, again, that impact given the locations in which the data is going to be processed, or where the data originates from, that mean that you need to extend the scope of this to make sure that the vendor is not just agreeing to protect data that originates from Europe or the UK to the GDPR standards. It might be appropriate to actually extend the scope of the DPA so that the vendor is agreeing on a global basis to protect all of the data it receives or processes on your behalf to the standards set out in the data processing agreement. So being very clear, sometimes you'll see a scoping happening, very common for the vendors to say the DPA only applies to data that's regulated by the GDPR. Well, hang on a minute. does that mean we haven't got enough protections then for data that might be regulated by other global regimes? What about the UK now that Brexit's happened? So just making sure that the scope is sufficiently broad to meet your own regulatory requirements.
I think a classic example there might be if vendors carrying out marketing or advertising on your behalf, and there's a particular region that you're targeting. You want to make sure that when you're saying you're complying with law, well, what is that law, and have you called out that particular region in the actual DPA, in the definition of applicable data protection law? And you're giving a signal to the vendor that when we mean these are the standards and protections you have to adhere to, this is what we're talking about.
Yeah, and in some cases, it might, if you're, you might get comfortable with just extending a GDPR compliant DPA to protect all of the data globally, because we know that the GDPR sets a very robust and high standard for vendor compliance, contracting compliance. But there might be circumstances where a particular local regime, you wouldn't be meeting the requirements by just applying a GDPR DPA to that data, and you do need to include jurisdiction-specific terms. So that's starting to creep into DPAs. And I think, again, you need to be quite careful about how you introduce jurisdiction-specific terms, because, again, the goal here is to create a well-balanced DPA and one that is not going to hold up and create an overly onerous set of obligations or a overly complex DPA. But there are circumstances where you might need to introduce specific local law requirements and check that the vendor is actually going to be able to comply with those. And I think maybe, Richard, you can talk a bit about the CCPA as an example there, where it's not, just introducing the GDPR terms is not necessarily going to cut it and cover the CCPA requirements.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the contracting requirements under the CCPA are quite different to the GDPR, and that's going to remain the case when the CCPA is effectively replaced with the CPRA from the start of 2023. It's a different beast and it has different requirements. So if you're looking at a global DPA that's covering both areas and both laws, there are going to be slightly different terms we need to think about from a CCPA perspective. By contrast, in other US states, like Virginia and Colorado, those are states which are introducing their own data protection laws as well. We're seeing more and more of these laws starting to come in. But some of those actually might be closer to the GDPR. Virginia and Colorado, those are two examples which actually look a little bit more like the GDPR than the CCPA. So in some cases, your DPA might be enough for those. But again, you've got to think if there are other particular areas or laws that we need to be concerned about, and therefore we need to cover up with the DPA.
Yeah, and I would say as a general rule, for most jurisdictions, certainly when we've gone out to kind of test with outside, counsel in jurisdictions outside of our remit, so Europe and the UK, when we've gone and tested in places like Brazil and others, whether or not the core GDPR, DPA will kind of work for that jurisdiction. The general rule, of course, you always need to check this, check your own terms with those counsel, but the general feedback is, for the most part, those terms will work and usually goes over and above what those local laws will require. So again, it does mean that as a very general rule, again, it's always worth checking, but the GDPR terms provide an incredibly robust set of baseline terms for you to kind of apply that globally, or ask your vendors to apply it globally. So if you're kind of working on that 80-20 rule, or you want to be 80% compliant, it's a good standard to kind of commit your vendors to.
The next area that we thought we'd talk about are data use rights. So this isn't necessarily an area that's specifically covered by the GDPR or other laws, but it's a really important topic to think about when you're contracting with a vendor. In many cases, you might be entrusting them with your data, or perhaps it's in fact your own customers' data, and therefore you need to think about, well, how are they going to be using the data? Are they actually looking to scope out any additional rights to use that data for secondary purposes?
Yeah, and actually a really important part of understanding the broader kind of picture here is to make sure that you're not reviewing the data processing terms, which are usually, obviously, as we mentioned, set out in a separate agreement or addendum, that you're not just reviewing those data processing terms in isolation, because it's very, very common for the main service agreement to also include certain terms which relate to how the vendor is going to be processing data. And specifically, you'll often see that the vendor will carve out quite, often extra rights to use your data for certain secondary purposes, or they might be independently collecting additional data sets like usage data or service data being very common terminology that you'll see. They might be collecting that data from your end users or customers for their own purposes, and usually that's addressed in the MSA, and the DPA might look like they're just performing a processor role, but then when you go and look in the main agreement, you'll see all these extra rights that they're trying to carve out. And the reason why we need to be a little bit careful about that is if you have a vendor that's trying to carve out additional rights to use your data for secondary purposes, like to generally improve the services, to do benchmarking, and to do extra analytics, which is then going to use for broader business purposes. What it's trying to do is it's increasingly common for very data-first companies. They're wanting to use sophisticated AI or machine learning to evolve their products. All very important uses there to kind of make sure that they're doing that agile development particularly in a SaaS environment. But that often involves the processor then actually stepping away from being a pure processor of your data and into the role of being a controller for that secondary use case. And so that means that you need to be quite careful about whether or not that secondary use of the data, whether or not you've given sufficient transparency in your own privacy notices to enable the vendor to do that, whether you have a legal basis to be sharing the data or allowing the vendor to use that data for that secondary purposes. So, it's something that we see increasingly come up. It's something that we have to, in many cases, try and accommodate to get the value of some of these, incredibly data-rich tools and services. That they need some of that data to improve that service and give you the extra add value that you're getting from having, a SaaS solution that's, data first, etc. But you need to make sure that that use doesn't put you out of compliance with your own, privacy notices or the contractual commitments that you've made to your own customers if you yourself are a processor. So just be very careful and, check for those additional use rights and consider whether or not this invites additional compliance obligations that you need to be addressing before you can grant those rights to the vendor. The other thing to spot is sometimes the vendor, because they may not have the direct relationship with the data subjects whose data they're trying to process as a controller, they may flow down a bunch of obligations to you, which are things like, you'll provide notice about how they're processing data as a controller, you'll include a link to their privacy policy. Some, in most cases they won't go that far because they're trying to do this a little bit covertly. But just make sure that they're not pushing a whole load of liability and responsibility onto you for enabling that secondary processing by them as a controller. And in fact, that's either unreasonable or you just can't comply with those extra commitments.
And even in those cases where you are comfortable giving the vendor broader rights to use your data, think about are there any conditions or restrictions you still want to place on the vendor in terms of how they're using the data. So for instance, are you going to say, well, that's fine, but only use the data in aggregate or anonymized form? You have to anonymize all of the data that you receive if you want to use it for those purposes. Or maybe you say that's fine during the life cycle of the contract, but after the agreement, you have to delete all of that data, and we're not prepared to give you perpetual rights to use it. So even where you are more comfortable granting those broader rights, maybe it's kind of a give to get model that you're engaging with, there are still some restrictions that you might want to consider putting in place.
And you may just say, I don't want you to touch my customer data for those secondary purposes because I don't have the contractual rights to give you the ability to use that, and it's going to put me in breach of all of my downstream customer commitments. So again, to Richard's point, you need to introduce whatever additional conditions you might need to impose on the vendor to get comfortable with that use, or just say, I want a kill switch option. I don't want you to use the data for those extra purposes.
Finally, we should also mention that the French CNIL has actually published guidance on where you're engaging a service provider and they're using data for broader purposes, and some of the things you need to be thinking about. one of the key points in that guidance is, Keneal points out, well, the vendor in that circumstance, they may lawfully be able to use it for a secondary compatible purpose, but in doing so, they will be acting as a controller. So the vendor has to be thinking about their own compliance obligations too.
Yeah, and it actually calls on the controller, so the customer, to do what they call a compatibility test to check whether or not they can, whether that secondary use falls within the scope of the purposes of processing that have effectively been communicated to the underlying individuals. So that's putting quite a big burden on the customer there to do some initial work to test whether or not they can give those rights and still stay within compliance with their own obligations under the GDPR. And in fact, our colleagues are running a webinar on the 20th of April, which is going to look more carefully into that guidance and questions over anonymization and pseudonymization, which you might find really useful. So we can look out for another webinar for Fieldfisher happening on the 20th from our UK colleagues on that topic.
Okay, so the third area we're going to talk about, sub-processors. Okay, this is the one which can get a little bit tricky in terms of negotiating. It attracts a lot of attention, and clearly for good reasons, because you want to be thinking about the chain of custody with the data, and you want to be ensuring that wherever your data is going with the vendor, that you're happy with who those sub-processors might be at a downstream level. Well, what should the DPA say about sub-processors? Normally, this is all based on what the GDPR says should be in the contract. The first is that the vendor should always remain liable for the sub-processors that it engages. Now, this one isn't particularly controversial, or it shouldn't be. If the vendor doesn't want to be liable for its downstream sub-processors and remain responsible, then that's a bit of a red flag. So ordinarily, that's not something where you should expect much pushback from the vendor. The other area is what level of authorization you should be providing for sub-processors. So in some cases, you might have to provide a specific prior authorization for the vendor to engage any sub-processors. And that effectively means if they want to engage a new sub-processor, they have to get your prior consent before doing so. The alternative to that is that you give a general authorization, and that means that the vendor doesn't have to go to you beforehand, but they still might have to notify you that they're making that change. Now, clearly, pretty much every vendor is always going to push for that general authorization. They don't want to be getting specific consent in every case. In particular, if they've got hundreds or thousands of customers, they don't want to be making special cases. And you yourself, you might be comfortable providing a general authorization as well, but just think, depending on the context, is there a particular reason why we might actually want specific authorization? So for instance, is this regulated data or particularly sensitive data? Is there a particular concern around where the data is transferred or processed? Should it really remain within region? And therefore, do you want to be giving a prior consent before the vendor changes who their sub-processors or subcontractors are? So that's one thing to think about. Now, related to that is notification of changes to sub-processors and your ability to object. Now, this stems from the GDPR. So sometimes in the DPA, the vendor will only afford you those rights if the data is subject to the GDPR. But increasingly, we're seeing customers push for that on a global scale to say, look, it doesn't matter where the data is from or what law it's subject to. You need to notify us if you're making any changes, and we should have the right to object and say, no, we don't think you should engage that sub-processor. You need to make alternative arrangements. Now, that might be what the requirements are at a high level, but the law doesn't specifically say, well, what level of notice should the customer or the controller be provided, and what happens if the controller isn't happy and wants to object? What happens in those circumstances? So that's where the devil of the detail really comes out. So think about how much notice is the sub-processor, how much notice is your vendor going to give you around changes in sub-processors? That could be anything from we will actively notify you 1 month before we change or replace our sub-processors, Or it might be at the other end of the spectrum, we have a published list of sub-processors online, and you're expected to check that, and we're not necessarily going to commit to any length of time before we make that change. You've got to be thinking about, well, what practically does that do for us in terms of assessing the change, enacting our ability to object, or to kind of conduct our due diligence and review what the use of that sub-processor could mean for us. And similarly, if you do have the right to object, well, what happens if you do? Does that mean that you negotiate with the vendor to find an alternative? Do you have the right to terminate that ineffective part of the service, or perhaps to terminate the agreement in whole if you object to a sub-processor and you can't find an alternative solution? You always have to think about, well, where is this actually going to take me, and how strong is that right? So those are some of the things to think about. And in the back of your mind, you should always be thinking about, well, are there any obligations that I myself have committed to, in which I have to make sure that I'm flowing down to the vendor here? So for instance, if this vendor is going to be processing your customer data and you have made commitments to your customers around that chain of custody, then you want to be able to make sure you can meet those commitments further upstream and have those reflected in your vendor DPA. So, it all comes down to what could be a fairly complicated chain in terms of different levels of processing and who's involved. So that's sub-processors. We're going to briefly now talk about security. Now, this one, for a lot of data protection lawyers, if you're a privacy professional, you're not necessarily a security expert per se. So this comes down to how the vendor essentially pass through your own internal InfoSec audits and due diligence to make sure that it's meeting your minimum standards. So for instance, that could be you're requiring the vendor to commit to your own security schedule. This is your minimum terms and minimum protections that you require of the vendor. Or in some cases, the vendor might have their own standard terms, and they say, this is how our service is provided. We're not prepared to enter bespoke arrangements with customers. And then your InfoSec will clearly need to review those and make sure that they meet your requirements.
Yeah, and it's just to say also that the GDPR isn't particularly descriptive about what security measures need to be in place. We know it has this very broad principle, which really frustrates information security experts who are used to having to implement clear security controls. GDPR requires that the vendor commit to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures, very much reflecting the risk-based nature of the GDPR. So it's on you to determine and work with the vendor to figure out what is appropriate given the nature of the data that's being processed. I will say that in addition to the DPA, you also need to think about if you're agreeing and implementing standard contractual clauses, that has a security annex, which includes a non-exhaustive list of the types of measures that also may be appropriate. So actually it's become quite a good checklist of standard measures that you should be looking to get your vendor to kind of comply with. So just making sure that you've got sufficient detail coming back in the security descriptions provided by the vendor if you're working from their policies to meet both the GDPR requirements and the detailed security measures that now need to be listed in the annexes to the standard contractual clauses.
Okay, so now come on to probably the most contentious topic, and that's liability. I mentioned earlier that the GDPR and other data protection laws, they don't prescribe what liability terms should be in place between a controller or a processor, which means there's this big area for negotiation as to exactly how that liability should be apportioned. And it's clearly going to be a really important area for negotiating any kind of DPA. And I'll come back to it now to a little bit more about this.
Yeah, so one of the things to bear in mind is that it's ultimately the controllers who remain accountable under the GDPR for ensuring that data that's processed by the controller or any third-party processor, it's processed in compliance with the GDPR data protection principles that are kind of set out in Article 5. If you're a controller and you're sitting at the end of a long chain, it's ultimately you that's responsible for ensuring that the processing that happens through the chain is done in compliance with GDPR. However, through the contract, we obviously want to make sure that we're chaining responsibility. So each processor in the chain is going to commit to be responsible for its processing and the processing of its sub-processors. And the one thing that the GDPR did dramatically change from the old data protection directive is that it also directly regulates data processes in certain respects. And so it does mean that effectively, if it means that individuals, if they want to come and bring a claim for damages that they've suffered because somebody in the chain has breached the GDPR, there's effectively a regime whereby individuals can come and claim against either the controllers or processors involved in the processing on a joint and several basis. So really making it very easy for individuals to come against anybody who's been involved in the processing that has caused them damage. And then if you look at the allocation of regulatory responsibility, it's very much the case that the processor can be liable if it was in some way responsible for the damage, no matter how minor that responsibility. So if, for example, the processor, the damage was caused because the processor failed to comply with their processing instructions, or they failed to comply with some of their regulatory obligations of the GDPR, which are principally focused around making sure that they're protecting the data with appropriate security measures, then they can be liable in full to the data subject for any damages that they have suffered. And then the controller is really, because they bear the bulk of the compliance responsibilities, they definitely are more exposed to data subject claims. And the only way the controller is ever going to get off is if they were completely fault-free, which is rarely the case. And then if you are a controller, you also, there's a risk there that if the processor has messed up, then you could also be liable for breaches directly of the GDPR and subsequently regulatory fines if it can be shown that you didn't exercise sufficient due diligence, you didn't have sufficient contractual terms in place with that processor, or you didn't monitor their compliance sufficiently. Those are all grounds for a controller to be directly liable for data protection fines under the GDPR as well. So with this kind of liability in mind, we also therefore want to make sure that when you're looking at the limitations and exclusions of liability, that you've got sufficient ability as a controller to be able to recover from your data processors any damages that, for example, you might have paid out to a data subject. If they've come and pursued you because you've got the deeper pockets for their damages, you want to make sure that you've got the ability to turn around and recover those damages from your data processor. Now, the GDPR does effectively provide for what is in effect a statutory indemnity. It kind of says that if you are a party that's paid out for all of the damages and there are other parties in the processing chain who are responsible for that damage, you can, go and seek to recover your damages, the damages that you paid out, any contribution that was due to those other processors. There is, in effect, an indemnity baked into the GDPR. But you might want to make sure that your contract kind of boosts your ability to recover from from your processor by baking in a clearer contractual indemnity so that you're not just relying on that statutory indemnity. That might be something that you want to bake in there if you think that there is, a high risk of claims or damages or anything like that. You might want to boost your ability to recover from the processors or an indemnity. The other thing to look out for is, given that you're more exposed to claims or fines there, you also want to make sure that your data processor hasn't tried to wriggle out of any liability by, completely excluding their liability for all loss, or, imposing an unreasonably low liability cap so that you're left with no contractual recourse or ability to kind of recover from the data processor. So really making sure when you're looking at the limitations and the exclusions of liability, for years it was pretty common for vendors to accept unlimited liability for data protection because under the old data protection directive they weren't as highly regulated. It was almost treated like a breach of confidentiality. Now we've seen a trend where vendors are increasingly capping their liability, often by reference to the general service cap. And at that point, you need to consider whether or not that's going to give you enough recourse given the risks associated with the data processing. So this usually means that you need to be looking at the master services agreement and how liability is addressed there, and then considering whether or not you need to negotiate a higher, maybe dedicated super cap for data protection. That's increasingly the compromise here. And then making sure that the exclusions of loss don't leave you with any ability, for example, to recover the loss of data in a security breach scenario. So definitely worth some time reviewing the MSA and the limitations and exclusions and liability there to make sure that all the good work that you've done drafting really robust data protection terms in the DPA is also then reflected in a reasonable allocation of liability and an ability for you to recover a reasonable sum in the event that the processor, breaches the GDPR, breaches their contract, and you've suffered some kind of damage or loss, whether through third-party claims or through regulatory fines.
So an example might be, it's very common that a vendor will limit their liability to 12 months fees, so the value equivalent to 12 months fee paid by you. And in some cases, you'll look at the contract value and say, well, it's not enough. That doesn't reflect the level of risk considering the sensitivity of the data you're processing. And therefore, we're going to have to increase that limitation. And you might do so either by applying a multiple to the value of the contract, so saying, well, we'll take 12 months fees and we'll multiply it by a certain figure. Or you could say, actually, we're going to get a set figure here. So we're going to go for a specified amount, whether it's in the hundreds of thousands or millions of value, that to more properly reflect the actual risk for you in engaging with the vendor.
Yeah, and then the other thing just to kind of flag here is, again, just going back to this point that we don't want to create a contract which is so overly onerous, and we're asking for such, the vendors to take on a reasonable amount of liability that we're just not going to be able to negotiate that, or it's going to hold up the whole contracting process. So it needs to reflect a realistic, reflection of the riskiness of the processing. So that means you might need higher caps if the data or processing operations are particularly sensitive in nature. But you might be more comfortable accepting kind of lower caps in scenarios where it's pretty vanilla processing activities. It's not one where the damage, even if there was, for example, a breach and the data was exposed, it's unlikely that there would be a scenario where if that data was exposed, it would create any real damage for the data subjects. So really kind of having a careful look at that, and not in all cases asking for an unreasonable, cap or indemnity from vendors, because if you're imposing both very onerous terms and very onerous liability terms, again, you're probably not going to be able to negotiate both with many vendors.
Something else to consider is that you've got to think across all of these different aspects of liability together. So, for instance, you might have some limitations within the contract that actually include any indemnities you might have separately negotiated. So does that actually water down the strength of those indemnities that you're very proud to have negotiated? But unfortunately, a limitation still applies. So thinking, how do those interact with each other? Not only if you're looking at the DPA itself, but across the whole agreement within the MSA too.
Yeah, and it's also just a reminder, you don't need an indemnity to recover your damages. In many ways, an indemnity is nice to have. Remember, I mentioned there is that provision for a statutory indemnity in the GDPR. And you may find that if you remove an indemnity, which is often something vendors kind of fear, seeing an indemnity for data protection, if you remove that, it might be a way to negotiate a higher data protection cap. So you can play around with some of that to kind of achieve a more reasonable kind of compromise. The other thing that I think that's important is to think about the liability triggers. So, if you've carefully managed the supplier due diligence, and you can get reasonably comfortable that this is a supplier which looks to be a good bet. They've got very, very good security in place. Again, that might be a scenario where you're happy to accept a slightly lower liability cap because you've satisfied yourself that this is a vendor where there's not a huge amount of risk here. Equally, this idea that sometimes you'll see you're putting your vendors on the hook for any breach of a DPA. That's a pretty broad liability trigger, and again, they might not be so happy to accept that piece. That kind of wide trigger. You might get some serious pushback from that. So thinking about that piece as well. And then just finally, we're really running over time here, so probably so much to talk about, but there's no point having enormous contractual liability coverage from a supplier only to find that it's uninsured and will be bankrupted and unable to pay you anyway. So just a final point to check whether or not actually that vendor does have good cyber insurance, that that they're going to be able to stand behind whatever liability cap they agree to.
So that brings us to the end for today. Now, originally we had hoped to take questions during the webinar, but obviously as this is pre-recorded, we can't take them now. But feel free to reach out to Flick or myself if you do have any questions. We'd be more than happy to keep this conversation going. And if you want more content from us, we're still planning our own webinars coming up next in SVO, Silicon Valley, but from our London colleagues, we have a couple of webinars in the diary. Wednesday, the 20th of April, our webinar for anonymization and pseudonymization. And they're also doing what's set to be a really interesting webinar on the 28th of April, all around ad tech and data privacy issues. So those are two ones to look out for.
Well, thanks very much, everyone.